To speaker number 118, Stephanie Smith.
Hello. Um, my name is Stephanie Smith. I live in Vancouver. I'm speaking in a personal capacity, but for context, I'm a union activist and a Labour Council delegate. I was a long-time legal representative for tenants, many of them in nonprofit housing, and I've worked for nonprofits that provide social housing. I live in a co-op. And I hope you'll take all of that into account when I tell you that, unfortunately, I can't support this motion. And the reason is that I don't think the motion will achieve what it says it will. I don't think it deepens housing affordability, and I think it increases the risk of tenant displacement. And I think we're in this position because this is a policy that isn't driven by or responsive to the needs of actual renter households in Vancouver. Instead, it appears to be driven by the nonprofit housing sector, who are important institutional actors, but only a part of the picture. Last week, I heard a lot of comments about how nonprofit housing providers might deepen affordability, but I think it's important to evaluate this motion based on its bare language. We have to assume that it will achieve only the minimum standards it requires. Built into those standards is a very questionable definition of social housing. I think that if we've learned one thing from all the speakers, it's that this bad definition of social housing is getting in the way of making good housing policy. Within that definition of social housing, we're looking at a minimum standard of 30% of units at Hills rates and the rest at whatever the housing provider can charge. Housing income limit for a one-bedroom or studio is $55,500 a year. The median renter household income in Vancouver is $50,250 a year, so Hills rate units are only affordable to renter households above the median. This motion refers to grocery clerks and healthcare workers. Most grocery clerks can't afford a Hills rate unit, let alone the remaining 70% of the units in these buildings. Not too long ago, I was working in a City of Vancouver funded frontline position, and in that role, I was borderline for a Hills rate unit. It's compelling to talk about housing for healthcare workers, but meanwhile, there are waiters and line cooks and office cleaners and, in my acquaintance, singers and horn players and painters, and this housing is not for them. And these are the people who are hanging on by their fingernails in the last bits of affordable market rental housing in Vancouver. As we heard when Council considered the motion regarding six-story buildings, these zones contain a significant amount of what's left of Vancouver's affordable market rental stock. Between speculative pressure from REITs in one direction and developers on the other, these tenants are being squeezed out. And to be blunt, what's proposed here is to tear down their apartment buildings and replace them with more expensive buildings that they can't afford to live in, except that they'll be operated by nonprofit housing providers. If these folks have been able to secure a non-market unit, I don't see anything here that compels the housing provider to maintain the current affordability levels on redevelopment. And on top of it all, in these internally subsidized models, nonprofits are gravitating to a loophole in the residential tenancy regulation can result in unpredictable and unaffordable rent increases for tenants in these RGI units. I'm also concerned that this proposal uncritically advances the TRP as sufficient to protect those tenants. As someone who's worked with displaced tenants and as any tenant advocate can, has told you, it isn't. I think it's important to take notice of the fact that Councillor Wiebe has recused himself because he's received advice that this proposal could increase his property value. Even if agreements with the city could dampen any increase in land lift on properties currently owned by nonprofits, and even if the density increases only apply to nonprofit housing development, all councillors will be familiar with one-off density increases for public benefit or otherwise being used as levers for increased density on nearby sites and creating upward pressure on land values. This motion proposes to give away an enormous amount of public density. I think it's incumbent on Council to ensure that it returns sufficient public benefit. Unless we have workforce housing that actually houses the workforce, rental housing policies that are alive to the economic circumstances of actual renter households, I don't think it does. So what I would ask Council is this: reconsider the definition of social housing, strengthen the TRP, and receive and consider the B2 report on tenant protections that I believe is due this quarter. Consider what you can do to advance the security of tenants whose needs aren't addressed here, and do that before you embark on yet another densification proposal that could increase their displacement. Thank you.